How many of you have parents who've told you that cell phones cause brain cancer? This study was published using data from pooled case-controlled studies over a long period of time. It showed that those who used cell phones for 25 or more years were 200% more likely to develop brain gliomas. 200%. That's enormous. But you know, and I know, that they were talking about relative risk. If your everyday risk of developing a glioma is 3 out of 100,000, a 200% increase brings that to 9 out of 100,000. Yes, from a statistical standpoint, that is a 200% increase. That may be statistically significant, but is it clinically relevant? Does it mean that you're going to stop using your cell phone? Here's another study that came out saying, here's another study that was published in 2018. It even made it to the National Toxicology Program paper on the U.S. Health and Human Services about cell phones. It had to do with animals. It was an animal research study that showed that 2 types of tumors in male rats exposed to the same type of radio frequencies that were found from cell phones developed brain tumors. The thing is, what you didn't see unless you looked at the source document was that the tumors only occurred in the male rats, and there was no association between this exposure to cell phone radiation in female rats, male or female mice. And let me just give you a brief explanation about why radiation from cell phones cannot cause cancer. The type of energy that can penetrate into the cell and cause damage is called ionizing radiation. This is ultraviolet radiation from the sun, X-rays, gamma ray radiation. This ionizing radiation end of the spectrum penetrates into the cell, into the nucleus of the cell, damages the DNA, resulting in the formation of proteins that lead to tumor development. The non-ionizing end of the spectrum, the longer wave radiation, includes radio and cell phones. This is not the type of radiation that can penetrate the cell, get into your cell nuclei, and cause cancer. Yes, they put off heat, but they don't put off the kind of heat that is going to cause cancer. The next time someone tells you to put away your cell phone because you're at risk for developing brain cancer, make sure they're not driving the car. Let's talk about something called tooth fairy science. Tooth fairy science is a phrase that was first used by a wonderful gentleman named Ray Hyman. It says, before we try to explain something, we should make sure it actually happened. It refers to doing research on a phenomenon before establishing that phenomenon actually exists. It's what we call looking for prior probability, because extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. How many of you have gotten money when you lost a tooth? I see your hands out there. I'm curious how much you got. Did you get more money if your tooth was in a baggie or if it was wrapped in a Kleenex? Did you get more money if it was the first tooth or the last tooth? Does the money correlate with your parents' income? We can collect lots of data. We can analyze it over a long period of time. The results can be statistically significant. We're ticking all those boxes on what makes good science. But what's the problem? What have you learned? Well, I hate to break it to some of you, but there's no such thing as a tooth fairy. So even though all this research can be done that's statistically significant, it's being done on something that is not possible. And that's the problem with a lot of these alternative practices. There's no prior probability. Homeopathy is one of the biggest uses of tooth fairy science that I can think of, and I'll be interested to hear what you have to say about homeopathy. When encountering a new or questionable claim, before you accept it, ask who disagrees and why. We have to get outside our bubble. There's too much misinformation out there, and we have to critically evaluate these claims before we make a mistake that could have a devastating impact on our health. Jenny McCarthy's post hoc ergo propter hoc error. This is the one that she's the mother of the anti-vaccine movement after Andrew Wakefield. She said, after my son had his vaccine, he developed autism. Therefore, vaccine caused autism. Dr. Hall refers to this as a typical rooster error. She didn't try to find out what others said. She only looked for people who agreed with her. She didn't find out who disagreed or why. And she began the anti-vax movement in the U.S. Her pediatrician, Dr. Jay Gordon, believes that vaccines cause autism, and he spreads false information. This is one of his quotes. I base everything I do on having spent the past 30 years in pediatric practice watching tens of thousands of children get vaccines, not get vaccines, and the differences I see. Jay Gordon is the pediatrician of the stars. Do you think his patient base is a little bit biased and that what he's seeing is a little bit biased? Well, speaking of biases, here's one of mine. I like what Dr. Mark Chrislip says. Chrislip's caution, in my experience, are the 3 most dangerous words in medicine. Do you want your treatment to be based on experience or scientific research? Experience can guide your philosophy, but is it a way to practice medicine? Experience is very compelling. I saw it with my own eyes. The problem is experience is often misleading. We misperceive, we misinterpret, we don't remember things correctly. Our brain, another quote from a great scientist, the first principle is that you must not fool yourself. And you are the easiest person to fool. All right, now we're going to talk about some alternative practices. Again, for your final, you'll be asked to look at Dr. Hall's videos, 1 or 2 of them, and also videos by practitioners. Some of the information that you're going to hear from me is going to come from her information. And as I said earlier, I don't have any problem with you hearing it twice. Reiki is one of the 2 most common forms of energy healing. The other one is called therapeutic touch. It was, discovered in 1822 by Dr. Mikao Usui in Japan. Practitioners of Reiki claim to be able to channel energy from a universal source and direct that energy from the universal source into the recipient to heal them. It may or may not involve touching. I'd like you to now stop and watch the first 3 minutes of this video. It's on Blackboard. Emily Rosa has managed to maintain a very private life. She's the youngest person to have ever published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. She's now probably in her 30s, and I can't find anything on social media about her. Please have a look. The first 3 minutes will be what I'd like you to know for class, but of course you can watch the whole thing. Then there's homeopathy, which was founded in the late 1700s by Samuel Hahnemann, who wrote his first paper on it in 1796. Homeopathy is rooted in mysticism and alchemy. He looks at disease as a matter of disruption of the vital force, a mystical, invisible force that controls our health. Now you have to understand what medicine was like around the 1800s when he began practicing. There was no germ theory, there were no vaccines. Basically, medicine was based on something called the 4 humor theory. And I'm not talking about it being funny. The 4 humor theory was based on a balance of hot, dry, wet, and cold. If you were sick, it meant there was an imbalance in these humors, and these humors could be balanced by bloodletting, purgatives and emetics, and mercury. In many cases, not being treated was better than going to the doctor at this time. The 2 basic principles of homeopathy are the law of similars and the law of infinitesimals. The law of similars means like cures like. In other words, a remedy will cure a disease in a sick person if it causes the same symptoms in a healthy person. You got that? The law of infinitesimals means the smaller the dose, the larger the effect. So, kind of, the less sugar you put in your coffee, the sweeter it tastes. I'd like you to stop and look at this video on how homeopathic remedies are made, and then come back and tell me about what you think about how homeopathic remedies are made. Typical homeopathic dilutions are multiples of 100. We have 6C, meaning there's one molecule of the mother tincture in 10 to the 12th molecules of water or alcohol, or I don't know. A typical dilution is 30C. In order for there to be one atom of the active ingredient in a 30C dilution, you would need to have a pill that's the size of the earth. Here's a homeopathic remedy for cough, a wet cough or a dry cough. Please note it says this claim is based on traditional homeopathic references and not modern scientific evidence. Please keep that in mind when you make decisions on what kind of treatment you want when you're sick. Here's a homeopathic remedy for fatigue and exhaustion. If we keep in mind the law of similars and the law of dilution, if coffee keeps you awake, dilute coffee should treat insomnia. The more dilute, the stronger the effect. If you dilute out all of the coffee molecules, the water will remember them, and the effect will be even stronger. The memory will persist even after the water is dripped onto a sugar pill and allowed to evaporate. And each dilution must be shaken, not stirred. That's the succussing